In this video, we're going to take a look at Zbrush's material and rendering system. Now, we've touched a tiny bit on materials in the quick start video, as well as here and there in a few other lessons. In this video, we're going to take an in-depth look at the materials themselves and how we can tweak some of the render settings that'll be most important to us. So we're going to begin by working with the Wasteland Warrior model we created in the hard surface video. I'm going to go ahead and go into my subtools here, and I'm going to turn off visibility on the costume so we're only working with the head. Now, I have the head subtool selected. If I go into frame mode, you see I actually have polygroups for all the different parts here. So polygroups, if you have not watched the quick start video or the UI overview, polygroups are essentially tagged groups of faces that you can use to organize your mesh or isolate specific areas. So we'll leave frame mode, and over here we have our material palette. Now you remember everything on the left-hand side of the screen, these big buttons are all palettes. This opens up the material palette. Now the top section is called Quick Pick. These are the most commonly selected materials as well as our most recently selected materials. The bottom one, I'm going to skip the second one for right now. The standard materials, these are standard shading models. These are very similar to what you would find in other 3D applications. Essentially, these are all variations on the blend shader with different settings tweaked or with multiple shaders stacked up. There's a few things that sort of deviate from that. For example, the flat color material. If I turn that on, that strips out all shading information and just gives me the flat color. Whereas if I go to toy plastic, let's see, where did toy plastic go? I just saw it. There we go. Toy plastic is a shader that has an extremely high specular setting, so it gives this plastic look. Now you'll notice as I select different materials, the look updates on the model itself. Now the reason for that is ZBrush ZTools have a color channel, RGB, a material channel, M, and then an mRGB, which fills both color and material at the same time. So currently the only channel that's filled is the color channel for the cowl back here, which has a gray color assigned to it. If I go to the flat color material, you'll see there is a gray shade or gray color applied just to this polygroup. However, if I change my colors, you see the other subtools will actually change their color selection. The same is true for material. As I change materials, the material updates on all these parts. Now that's because the material channel has not been filled and the color channel has not been filled on those other pieces. So we'll take a look in a moment at how we fill those channels. Going back to our material palette, the midsection here, these are called matte cap materials. Now matte cap materials are a ZBrush material. It's a native material to ZBrush. These have lighting and shading baked in. They give you very, very nice looks. For example, if we change to gold, we get a nice gold look. If we change to some of my favorites are matte cap Sculpey, which is a shading material that's based on the polymer clay Sculpey. We have Polyskin, which is a nice sort of skin shader. These materials are generated from reference images, and they're very, very nice, but the difference between this and your standard materials are I can't change my lighting interactively on anything in the matte cap materials section. So while these are extremely nice materials that render very nicely, we must use the standard materials if we want to do things like interactively light our model. That's because lighting is baked into a matte cap material. I often say as I'm working, if I want to do a nice, pretty show render of an object, I'll select a matte cap material like matte cap gray because it gives a nice satin finish and it has a tendency to kind of hide little imperfections in the model. Whereas anytime I am sculpting, I always use basic material 2 because it's essentially a blend shader. It gives me a shadow, mid-tone, and a highlight, which makes it very easy to see any little nuance on the surface. Like right there, I can see a little dent that I might want to tighten up sculpturally. So things like that are much, much easier to spot under the basic material 2, which is a standard material, rather than something like the gray shader, which always seems to give me a nice satin smoothed off finish. So let's come down to our basic material 2 again. Now, once more, anytime I change my material, it's updating on the model. Now, if I want to assign a material, I turn on the M channel. That will assign just material. If I turn on RGB, I will assign color. If I turn on mRGB, I will assign both material and color, but we're going to stay to material. Now I'm going to go to color. While I've got the material selected, I will go to color, fill object. Now that has filled the material channel for this entire subtool. If I turn on solo, everything that you see in solo mode has been filled with that basic material too. So now if I were to change my material, it will not update on the surface of the model. It's going to give me always the material that I have filled into the material channel. If I turn off solo, you'll see that any material setting or any material selection will update on the other subtools because those have not had their material channel filled. Now let's say I want to clear my material channel. In that case, I will go to Flat Color, stay on M, and I will go to Color, Fill Object. Now that clears the material channel for that subtool. So now, once again, if I select different materials, it will update across the model. Now, you can build your own material library by designing your own materials and saving them by going to the Material menu after you've changed your settings and saving it. You can also download other materials from the Pixelogic website and ZBrush Central. You can also go to Lightbox Materials, and there's some other shaders in here that are not in the default material palette, so be aware of that. These are being read out of the Z Startup Z Materials folder. So these are only read inside of Lightbox, just like Z tools and projects that don't load by default into ZBrush. You can load these via the Lightbox in the ZBrush install folder. So I'll go back now and select Basic Material 2. Material, Color, Fill Object. Now let's take a look at our material settings. Let's zoom into the piece here so you can see it a little bit more clearly. And let's open the Material menu and click the little radio icon to dock it on the side. So here you see in the Material menu, I can load and save materials. I can open up the Lightbox. Now I have a button to save as startup material. Now, startup materials, that is the material that is on your model by default when you start ZBrush. So previously that has been the red wax shader. As I said before, my preference is basic material too, so I select that material and then go to save as startup material, and that saves in my preferences. So every time I start ZBrush, I start with the basic material too. That's here as the startup material. Now you can change that to whatever you want, and personally, I recommend basic material too, just from a sculptural standpoint and a teaching ZBrush standpoint. I think it is the best material to sculpt on for the reasons I said before. I say it's an unforgiving material. Any mistake you make will be very visible on the surface, and it makes it easier to work. Now, I have this material selected and assigned to this subtool. Down here, I can click Show Used, and that will show me just the materials that are currently being used in my scene. So I've got green metallic, which is being used on these fasteners here, and I've got basic material too. That's everything that's being used right now. Here I have the ability to copy material. So if I copy that material, I can then go to another material. Let's say, for example, I go to Dots Oatmeal and then click Paste Material. That pastes that material into that slot as basic material 4. Now that's kind of a funny thing about ZBrush. If you want to copy a material in the material menu, you have to copy it and then paste it into an existing material slot. So you will sacrifice one of these other startup materials, which in many cases isn't a problem. I don't tend to use Gel Shader or the Dots Oatmeal. If you want to load a new material without sacrificing a slot, just save the material out with save and then load it into the material menu, and it will load into a new slot. So that is kind of a strange nuance of behavior that's important to understand. So let's go back to our basic material too, and we will go to modifiers. Now here I have all the modifiers for the material, and these will be familiar to anyone who's done look dev in Maya or 3D Studio Max. For example, specular. Here I've got my specular control. If I turn specular up, the surface becomes much, much shinier. If I turn it down, it becomes less shiny and more matte. If I open my specular curve, I can control the edges of that specular component. So right now it's quite a sharp specular curve. That gives me a very shiny plastic appearance. If I were to broaden this curve, it becomes a broader specular component. If I turn specular down, it starts to become more like skin, sort of the specular response of human skin. It's a bit broader. Also down here we have a variety of other controls. We have color bump, color shading. Most of these are only visible once we render. We have cavity shading and cavity colorize. So down here, if I go to my diffuse swatch, and if I select a color for this, if I click that, and then let's set our color to kind of a bluish hue like that. Now, before we go forward, I just want to make sure that everything has the same overall look. So I'm going to take the color white, go to RGB, and go to color, fill object, just to fill that color channel, just so everything's got kind of a unified look. So you see nothing changes on the surface of the model. However, if I come over here to colorize diffuse and turn this up, it will start to colorize the diffuse channel based on this diffuse swatch here. Now, if I were to render this, we're going to use the BPR render. The BPR render is the best preview render. It's the newest render designed for Zbrush. It was introduced a few versions ago, and it is, in most cases, the best renderer to use. There's also, under render, the best render here. Now, the best render is the previous best version of the Zbrush render. It does not do everything that BPR does as well. However, it does things that BPR does not. We'll see that in just a moment. I'm going to do a BPR render. You'll see that it's rendering and it's using my sample settings here under SPIX. So this will just take a moment. And we'll talk in more depth about BPR rendering in just a moment. I just want to illustrate for you that some of the settings under your materials will require the best render to actually be seen. And that's not really a problem. You can use both render passes. There we go. Here you see our render with some nice shadows on there. I want to say that you can actually combine both render passes if you use the Zbrush to Photoshop plugin. There's a video specifically on that, and it will render out a pass in both Best Render as well as BPR, so you can actually combine the effects of both. So there we have very basic BPR render. Now here we have a cavity option. So if I take the cavity and let's maybe make this sort of a greenish hue. So this is the color that we'll put into the cavities. So if I come down here to, there we see there's colorize ambient, here we go, cavity intensity. I can set this to a negative or positive value. Let's just turn these up. Cavity radius will turn up. Cavity colorize we definitely want to turn up. And just do a little bit of cavity, diffuse and specular, and that should be good. Now, if I render this with BPR, I want you to notice that the cavity shading component does not come across. The reason for that is cavity shading is a material component that is only used in the best renderer. So you see we don't see it there. However, if I go ahead and tap on the background, that clears the render. If I go to render and then press best, that does a best render. It's a different rendering engine. And here you can see it's actually bringing that cavity component into the model. So let's see, maybe we can, let's see, we've got cavity intensity. We'll leave the cavity intensity where it is, cavity colorize. Let's turn this to let's keep that up. And let's take cavity intensity and let's set this to a negative value. Now, as I change settings while I'm in best render, it will re-render. So I'm just going to have to hit the escape key to cancel out of that so I'm no longer sitting in best render mode. And let's go to where was cavity intensity and turn this back to a negative. There we go. And there we go. You see that that puts the color in cavity on the high points, and it leaves the recesses unaffected. Now this could be a really cool way to create sort of a distressed chipped paint effect, or just two different types of color or materials on an object. Like already here it looks like this was perhaps painted green at some point. We've got some areas scratched away. So cavity shading is quite a bit of fun to tweak. And again, you can only use this in best render mode. If I go to my renderer and turn off best and go back to preview, those effects will disappear. And when I BPR render, we won't see them at all. However, I will mention once again, in the Zbrush to Photoshop, you do have the option to do a best render and a BPR render and then composite the effects in Photoshop. If you want to learn more about that plugin, be sure to watch the video specifically on Zbrush to Photoshop. Okay, so our material settings here allow us to have a high degree of control over the object, or over the material settings for that particular material. Again, some of these are only visible in best render mode, and if you hold the control key down while you're over a slider, it will tell you that. For example, on cavity shading here, it says cavity shading is performed only in best render mode, so you're not entirely in the dark on what functions where. So let's go ahead now and take a look at another option in our materials, and that is the wax modifier. To see this, I want to open up something that's got more skin rather than this mechanical shape. So I'm going to open up another Z tool now. So I have initialized ZBrush, which has reset my materials and loaded up a new model here. Here we've got this troll that was done for ZBrush Live. If you'd like to see me actually sculpting and painting this troll, you can get on the ZBrush Live YouTube channel and actually watch that video for free. So what I'd like to do now is I would like to adjust this material with a certain degree of translucency so we can give more of a skin look. So I've got the basic material tool selected and I go to Material, Color, Fill Object. So I filled this subtool, the head, with the basic material too. Now I'll select the eyes and change my material. Let's go to toy plastic is often nice for shiny objects. So we'll take toy plastic and go to Material, Color, Fill Object, and that fills the eyes with a toy plastic material. And then we'll go to the teeth and let's go to our material menu here and let's select the basic material. Now the basic material has no specular on it, so I will go to Material, Color, Fill Object for the basic material. Now under basic material settings, I am going to turn my specular up and I'm going to go to my specular curve and I'm going to sharpen it so it looks more wet. So there we go. They're not quite as shiny and plasticky as the eyes, but it still gives me a little bit of shine on there. Now I will go to Color, Fill Object, while I have the material channel active. Now if I want to select a material that's on an object, I can click and drag from the material swatch here, and then when I mouse over an object, it will select the material that is assigned to that object. So here I've selected the basic material too. And under the material settings, we have wax modifiers. I'll open wax modifier and turn the strength up. Now it says wax modifiers are for the best preview render mode. For a real-time wax preview, we have to activate that in the render properties subpalette. So I click OK. Now watch what happens. If I go to the render menu, go to render properties and then turn on wax preview, this gives me this nice translucency to the skin. It gives this waxy quality, so it starts to feel a lot more like skin rather than just a default blend shader. Now, speaking of that, we want to change our specular component so it is more like the specular component of skin. So I'm going to open my specular curve and I will broaden the specular curve for basic material too. Then I will take my specular and I'll turn the specular down, and that's much more akin to a skin than it is to plastic or metal. So now let's do a render. I'll go ahead and position my model. I'm going to lock the camera so I don't accidentally move it because I like this angle. And I'm going to go to my lighting menu. And because we're using standard materials, I can interactively light this character. I'll turn on the key light and place it at about 11 o'clock. Turn on my secondary light and I'll bring it here to about 3 o'clock. I'm going to set the color of this to, let's give it a little bit of a green cast. Then I'm going to turn my intensity up quite bright. And then I'm going to click on that dot and that puts it behind the model. So now I can move that light around behind the model and give myself a nice rim light. I might lighten that green so it's not quite so strong. And let's turn that intensity up so we get a nice rim light. Now I'll select the key light and I'll set this to maybe an intensity of 1 just to give us a nice look there. And let's bring it up so it's a little bit more dramatic. There we go. Now I'm going to click Best Preview Render. And that's going to render with shadows. And you'll see in just a moment when it finishes rendering the effect that we get. And here we are. We've got our nice render with dramatic lighting and shadows. But notice the shadows don't really have a nice look to their edges. They're very, very hard. So how do we change that? We're going to go to the render menu and tear this off. Under render, we've got BPR shadow. Now here we've got the controls for all of our different settings. We've got BPR transparency, which we'll see in a moment. We've got BPR ambient occlusion. We have BPR filters, which we use in non-photorealistic rendering, or we can use them in photorealistic rendering. These are just post-render filters that we can use to tweak our resulting look. We have controls for anti-aliasing, etc., etc. Now, some of these are really for the best render, for example, fog, but the most important ones are the ones that are marked BPR. Now, we're going to look at BPR shadow. I want to soften the edge of my shadow, so I'm going to turn angle up. Now, angle will soften the edge of the shadow for free. It does not increase my render time. So I'm going to go ahead and render again, and I want you to watch the edge of the shadow when this render completes. You'll see that it's going to change drastically because we've changed that angle setting. There we go. We get a nice soft edge to our shadow now. Now, sometimes this can introduce banding because the angle control does not increase the render settings, it just softens the shadow. So I'll come to my rays. These are the rays that are cast to generate the shadows. I'm going to double that to 24 rays. Now this will increase my render time. In addition to that, I want to use ambient occlusion. So I'm going to turn on ambient occlusion here, and I will run this render again. Now it's going to take a bit longer this time because not only are we calculating ambient occlusion, we've increased the number of rays by ×2. So I'm going to pause and then come back when this render is complete, and you'll see the vast difference between this image and the image that we get with extra rays and ambient occlusion. There we go. Now you can see the resulting render has a lot more depth and nuance to it as a result of the component of ambient occlusion as well as the increased rays. So the skin or the wax modifier is really nice for just adding that extra little touch of a skin look to an organic creature. I'd like to talk to you now about transparency, which we can use on eyes or we can use on mech bits where maybe we have one portion that we want to be transparent that we can see through into other pieces. So I'm going to load up a different Z tool for us to talk about that. Now here I have initialized Zbrush and reset all of my render as well as my material settings. And here we have a tool that was created in the video on Snapshot 3D. There's two parts to this. I have the collapsed Boolean mesh, which is currently selected, which has some mechanical pieces visible on either side. And then I have this sphere. Now I want to assign a material to the current object. So let's go ahead and let's give it a green metallic. We'll go to Material, Color, Fill Object. So that's filled the mech parts with green metallic. Now I'm going to select the polysphere and go to Basic Material 2. And let's go to Material, Color, Fill Object. Now let's go ahead and put this at a little bit of an angle and then just do a quick render. Now here you can see the sphere is opaque and we cannot see anything through it. However, if I come down here and go to Display Properties, there is an option for BPR settings. If I open that, I can turn on transparent shading. And it asks if I want to turn on transparent render properties. Say yes, and that automatically turns that on. So now let's do our render again. I'll press BPR render. And that sphere is now transparent. I can see through it to the objects underneath. Now I can still use my material settings on here if I want to turn up my specular, give this a sharper specular component, maybe add a subdivision level so it's a little bit shinier. Let me go back to materials and go to my specular curve, and we can sharpen that even more just to give it a nice hard line or hard ping light there. Let's go to our lighting, turn on the secondary light, maybe bring that over here to the side. There we go. So we get two nice hot spots on this piece. Now I'm going to go to the render menu, tear this off, and under the render menu we have BPR transparency. Now I can control the overall strength like this. I can control the surface normal factor, that's the contribution of the surface normal. I can do this by color. I can change my color intensity factor if I am driving it by color, and I can adjust the refraction and the factor for that refraction. So let's try this again. Let's hit BPR render. And there you see our effect. Now let's change the surface normal. So let's go ahead and turn the surface normal factor up by, let's say, put it to 0.7, and then we'll repeat that render. There you see that the surface normal, the direction that we're looking, has more of an impact on how translucent that is. So it's kind of nice for making a foggy glass or maybe a dirty glass. We can adjust our refraction. If I turn this up from 0.5 to 0.89, render that. Let's go in here and just manually set this to 1 and turn our refraction factor up and render again. We'll start to get distortion through that glass. Turn our refraction down. There we go. Let's turn that down, turn that all the way down, and render. Oops. There we go. Now let's drive this by color. I'm going to go back to my shaded view, and I will select a color. Let's select blue, standard brush, no alpha. Go to RGB. Let's make sure we fill it with the color white first. Go to color, fill object. Then go back to RGB, select our blue. Make sure that we're not adding, we're only painting. And we'll do a little bit of a paint right there. Let's do it like this. Let's put it on the top right here. Now we'll do by color, turn that up, and BPR render. You see the color now has a component within this. Let's do by color 1. Turn this up, and there you go. That color controls a bit of the translucency. Let's turn up our factor for that. There we go. The higher our factor, the more we're going to get some opacity or some refraction around the edge, and the color area will be far more, will define far more what is actually being transparent. Let's turn the surface normal factor down to 0. There you go. So you can see the effect that's being given by that. If I turn my global strength down and then render again, there you see that it actually reduces the overall strength. Turn it down again, and you see only the area that has color is getting that transparency. So strength right there, transparency strength by surface normal is turned down. Refraction will turn up, color is turned all the way up, and the color factor is turned all the way up. So let's give it another go. There we go. So you can see that we can exercise a fair bit of control over how the transparency is applied to the surface. And this is really handy if you're going to be rendering inside of Zbrush. Here you can see that nice refraction along the edge there, so we can actually read the edge of that bubble. So it's a very, very nice way of getting transparency on selected objects. And this is a per object setting, so I'd have to have a separate object and apply transparency to that object to get it to respond. It's not something where I can paint a region and just have transparency on that region. So let's take a look now at the other type of material. We've been focused on just the standard materials here, the base models. Let's look at the double shader, tri-shader, and quad shader. We're going to examine these by looking at the double shader. The double shader, tri-shader, and quad shader allow you to stack up various copies of the other materials into a new material. So let's take a look at that now. I will open up another tool to demonstrate that. Now once again we have our Wasteland Warrior model from the hard surface lesson loaded up. I'll select the head subtool and go into frame mode, and you see that we've got all of our different polygroups. We're going to actually utilize these polygroups now. I am going to Control-Shift-Click on the face mask portion here. I want to isolate that. I am going to go to my material settings here. I'm going to select the double shader, and I'm going to go to Material, Color, Fill Object. Now that fills that face mask, just that revealed portion, with that material. You see the basic material is still on the other parts. If I click and drag to here, oops, click and drag to here, there we go. I get the double shader, click and drag to here, I get flat color. Nope. Oh, I don't have a material filled there. That's why you see as I change my materials, the other portions update. So let's go to basic material, and I will Control-Shift-Click to hide the mask. And then I will go to Material, Color, Fill Object, and I've filled the rest of the objects with the basic material. So now let's take a look at the double shader. I will go to the material menu and tear this off. The double shader allows me, Let me go ahead and show used. There we go. The double shader allows me two shader slots here. If I go to the basic material, you see that only has one shader slot. If I go to flat color, it only has one shader slot. Double shader has two. That allows me to stack two different shaders together and combine their effects. So I'm going to begin by selecting shader 1, and let's turn off shader 2. If this little button has a dot in it, that shader is turned off. So I'm on shader 1 right now. Now, shader 1, I'm going to come down here and let's set our diffuse color. Let's give it kind of a tan sort of look, something like this. And I will go to colorize diffuse and turn this up. And you see that's going to colorize just that selected part. And let's maybe lighten that just a little bit. Now it's showing up on the other objects here. If I alt-click on that subtool to select it, I can go ahead and fill that with basic material as well, so they do not update. So I'll go to Material, Color, Fill Object. Alt-click on my face mask again, and now we're on the Head subtool. So now I've filled this with a little bit of diffuse coloration. Let's go back to our double shader. There we go, in shader slot 1. So I want to change my specular. I don't want this to be shiny at all. I want it to be quite matte. So let's turn that specular down. Let's broaden that specular curve. So this will be kind of a matte sort of surface without a lot of shine on it. Now I'm going to go to my material menu and select Basic Material 2. Here I've got the option to copy shader. I'm going to copy shader, go back to double shade. I'm going to go to S2, turn it on, and I'm going to paste shader. So I've now pasted Basic Material 2 into this shader slot. So let's come down here to specular. Let's sharpen the specular curve, increase our specular, bring our diffuse down a little bit. Okay. Now what I want to do is I want to paint some sort of distressed paint on here. So I'm going to go to the standard brush. I'll use the spray stroke with the dots alpha. Make sure RGB is the only thing turned on, and let's select the color red. Turn off X symmetry, and I'm just going to isolate this piece by Control-Shift clicking on it, and let's put some color on here. Sort of like some areas of distressed paint. So maybe there's a little bit here, maybe a little bit here. I'm going to change to alpha 23. Oops, no, I'm not actually. I'm going to change to alpha 8. There we go, that's better. And I'm actually going to go to my spray stroke and I'm going to turn color down to 0 so it doesn't modulate my color. It's just using the color red that I selected. If you want to learn more about painting and poly paint, there is a whole video just on poly painting, which you would find very, very useful to watch. Let's do another stripe here, maybe down across the face here. So it's some kind of post-apocalyptic war paint of some sort. Let's do one here, and we'll do one here. There we go. So I've got some color on here now. I'm going to close out my modifiers and open up the mixer. Oops. Mixer is here. The mixer allows me to mix the difference between those two materials. So I am currently on shader 2. As you see, it is turned on. I'm going to change this to screen because I only want to grab the white from the specular component. Set this to black, and I'm going to select the color swatch, click and drag over to color, and I am going to turn up by hue. And you see what happens here is it actually forces that material only onto those areas that have that color. And then I can use my exponent slider here to sort of tweak this. There we go. If I turn this up and then turn my control down, let's actually set this back to 0 and do saturation. There we go. That's better. I use by saturation. Now, as I move around, you see how only the paint is getting that nice specular component there. Everything else is quite matte, but the paint retains that look. Here's another neat trick. If I go to masking, mask by color, mask by poly paint. Let's zoom in here. And let's click and drag over here and select that poly paint. I can tweak my tolerance. If I turn my tolerance up, you'll see it actually gets a little bit more of the edge of the mask there. Let's get a little feather on the mask. Let's zoom in here so we can see that better. Let's click F for frame, zoom in here, and if I turn my tolerance down, it's going to feather the edge of that mask just a bit. There we go, click OK. Now I've got a mask for those painted areas. If I control click on the background to invert that mask and then zoom in, I want to give a little bit of relief to this paint so it looks like it's sitting a little bit above the surface as paint would. It's been chipped away. So I'm going to go to deformation. I'll go to the inflate slider. Now this will take some trial and error depending. I'm going to hit 0.5 to begin with, and obviously that's too strong, so I'm going to undo that, and I'm going to set 0.05. There we go. That just gives me that little bit of raised edging to that paint. I think that's a really cool effect. And as we move around, you see that it actually gives us two different materials on that surface. So that's something that a lot of people don't know how to do, is how to apply multiple materials to a single surface in Zbrush. And other programs, there'd be other methods of doing that. Maybe you could use texture maps to drive where a material lives, which would also be like driving it with color. But it's really nice to know that you can do this here inside Zbrush and have multiple materials represented on a single object. So if I control shift click to reveal everything else, that will give me all of my other pieces and parts. If I control shift click on the face mask here, perhaps I want to put the double shader on that. So I will do material, color, fill object. Now let's go in with our standard brush, RGB. Oops. Make sure that we have the same red by control clicking and dragging to that. And then look what happens. As I paint red, I pick up that specular aspect of that second shader. So maybe there's a little bit of overspray there. Now, if I alt-click on another subtool, like these eye pieces, for example, we'll give them a matte cap material, which we're going to talk about next. I'll go to our matte cap shiny, go to material, color, fill object, and now the eye pieces and the filters have that material assigned to them. If I go to solo and then hide the eye pieces, I can change to matte cap gorilla, which is a nice matte sort of black. Go to color, fill object, and now the filter pieces have an entirely different material, even though they are the same subtool. So that is how we can take two different materials and assign them to the same object using a multi-shader, like the double shader, and the mixer. Now I can stack as many of these as I want together. If I go to my material menu, go to my material menu, here we are. I have the double shader, tri-shader, and quad shader. I can keep stacking up to 4 shaders together on a single surface. So that completes our look at the standard materials. Let's take a quick look now at the matte cap materials and how we can tweak some of their settings. I'm going to reset ZBrush and open up a new model, and we'll take a look at these. So now let's take a look at the matte cap materials. The matte cap materials are found here in the second section, and I'm going to start by selecting red wax. Now I'm currently on the body subtool. I'm going to select the color white, and I'm going to go to RGB, excuse me, I'm going to go to MRG, material and color, and then go to color, fill object, and that clears the material and the color channel, giving us just the red wax shader. Now you'll notice also that the eyes and the teeth do not have a material assigned to them, so they are picking up the same shader. Now let's take a look at how we can manipulate the settings on a matte cap material. Let's tear the material menu off, and if we go to modifiers, you see that at the bottom we have this image. Now matte cap materials will have a sphere like this. You may have one sphere or you may have two spheres. If you have two spheres, that means that you can control the A and the B sliders to affect the material. If you only have one sphere, then you're only going to be able to use the A slider to change material settings. Now, if we look here, we have an opacity slider. If I dial this all the way back down to 0, it just brings us back to our flat white. If I bring it back up, it gives me the opacity of that matte cap material. Now, matte caps also have cavity detection, and this is quite cool. If I turn cavity detection down, you'll see it no longer gives me this cavity shading that helps sort of delineate and accentuate all the recesses in the model. Now, cavity transition is set to -0.5. If I were to turn this up, it can flip that cavity detection, so I get the other material in the recesses and the lighter material on the high points. That's material B is on the high points. If I turn this down even further, it will further accentuate those recesses with that nice lighter shade down in the recessed areas. So we'll set this back to -0.5. And you see the depth of that material changes. If I take cavity detection and turn it all the way down to 0, we lose that cavity shading entirely. It just becomes a shinier, sort of less translucent shader. If I turn cavity detection back up, then I start to get accentuated cavities. Now next we have intensity A and intensity B. These are our first sliders that rely on the two different material swatches here. If I turn intensity A up, that's going to increase the intensity of slot A. If I turn intensity B up, it does the same. If I flip them, you see that we can start to get some really interesting kind of stylized effects here. I can turn up A and turn down B and really push some of that cavity. So if I don't dial back my cavity detection in conjunction with that, you can see what happens here. We're starting to only get that cavity along the sort of facing or the turning edge of the model there. So this is a nice way to create more stylized looks. It's fun to go in here and tweak these settings and see the different types of effects that you can get from the existing matte cap materials just by adjusting that intensity A and intensity B slider. And of course, those are only going to work together if you have two swatches here. Some matte caps only have one. So be aware that the B is contingent upon that second sphere existing. Now you see we have monochromatic A and monochromatic B, and both of these are set to 0, but if I turn this up, it starts to strip the color information out of either the A or the B material. So you can see there. Now depth A and depth B are very cool. You can adjust the depth of that particular material. So if I bring depth A all the way up, it's bringing it more to the surface. If I bring it back, it's flipping that depth control. And so this actually gives us a little bit of a variation in kind of the lighting and the surface material representation. Let's set the depth B, let's set depth A to 1. There we go. Now we have colorize. If I were to adjust colorize, let's turn this up and then overwrite color. You see that we can overwrite any poly painting that's on the material. Now we only have poly paint right now on the teeth, so let's zoom in there and so you can see this. So let's overwrite color, and that does overwrite the color, the poly paint. There we go. So if we set it to -1 and turn it up, we can wipe that poly paint out completely. Now we have a blur option here, and that gives us a little bit of blur in our cavity shading. Turn that back down. And then hue A and hue B. These are really probably some of the most useful. Hue A will adjust the hue for the A slider, for the A material. Hue B will adjust the hue for the B material. And if you watch your icon here, you can actually see the color on the background updating and the color on the foreground updating. So this is taking that into sort of a violet. If I bring it up here, it's going to bring it into kind of green. So this is actually quite a bit of fun to sort of tinker with these settings and see what you can come up with. Just from the red wax shader, you can create a whole lot of variations, giving yourself a nice kind of skin-like or creature skin-like material. So let's go to hue A and set that back to 0 and hue B. Saturation, will adjust the saturation for A, saturation for B. So we can dial back the saturation on one material and turn the saturation up on another. So it's pretty standard color controls. It's just a matter of the fact that you've got two of them. So if I turn my intensity A up, turn my hue A to something kind of golden or greenish. There we go. So we can start to get kind of a metallic look to that. We can adjust our intensity B. If we set it to negative, that's going to give us more of that cavity. Turn our blur up. It's going to give a little bit of blur to the material. You can retain high color A and retain high color B. And let's go back to our intensity, set that back 0, oops, intensity A, 0, 0, 1, and 1, intensity A, intensity B, oops, set that back to 1, there we go. So we can really blur those out, dial these back, intensity A, intensity B, there we go. And then we can adjust our high color or retain high color. Now we can adjust our orientation. So we change this slider. This has an effect on the lighting on the material itself. Remember, the lighting is actually baked in to a matte cap material. So orientation B, dial that back. You see that that does adjust the lighting effect on the model. Now let's say I like this particular material and I want to save it. In that case, I will go to Materials, Save, and I'll just save this as Custom Red Wax, or we'll call it Custom Skin Wax. Then if I were to, let's say, make any changes to this, there we go. And then I go to Material Load. I can load that custom material in, and it will bring it back. It's actually in my material swatches right here. So that completes this look at rendering and materials in ZBrush. I hope you found it helpful and it's demystified what for some people is a very difficult tool set to sort of dive into and understand, because while it shares so many parameters with look development in other programs, it does have its own methodology, especially when it comes to things like the matte cap materials. So I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next lesson.